Can you imagine what would lead a 74-year-old woman, widowed just 2 days prior, to completely disappear hours before her own husband's funeral? Margaret did exactly that. And the most shocking thing, she had just signed the papers that made her the heir to a fortune estimated at $47 million. She simply vanished, without telling anyone, taking almost nothing with her, just a small suitcase and an enigmatic note that read, "Finally, I'm going to live." But live what? Run. Away from whom? And why now, at the moment when everyone expected to see her frail and dependent on her family? The mansion was filled with relatives, lawyers, and staff, preparing the final details of the funeral for Richard, the millionaire husband who had built a real estate empire. Margaret was supposed to be there, dressed in black, receiving condolences, fulfilling the role everyone had expected of her for over 5 decades. But when they went to call her for the ceremony, the room was empty. The bed was made. The closet was full of untouched, expensive clothes. And there was that note on the dressing table, written in the trembling but determined handwriting of a woman who had just made the most radical decision of her life. Have you ever felt trapped, even though you had everything? Have you ever pretended to be happy for so long that you forgot who you really were? Margaret lived this for 50 years, and at that moment, faced with the death of the man who had controlled her, for decades, she made a choice that would shock everyone. The family panicked. The adult children, who barely knew their own mother, began making frantic calls. She might be confused, they said. She might be in danger, they speculated. The police were called. Private investigators were hired. After all, it wasn't just a missing elderly woman. It was an extremely wealthy elderly woman who had just inherited millions. The first 24 hours were filled with utter despair. They checked hospitals, hotels, bus stations. They reviewed security cameras. They questioned neighbors. Nothing. Margaret had simply vanished as if she had never existed. And the more they searched, the more questions arose. Why would she do this? Was there something no one knew about the seemingly perfect marriage? What was that woman, who had always seemed so submissive and unassuming, hiding behind that polite and silent smile she had maintained for half a century? What you're about to discover may surprise you and even change the way you see your own life. Because Margaret's story isn't just about escaping. It's about courage. It's about starting over. It's about a woman who, at 74, decided there was still time. Time to be free. Time to be herself. Time to finally truly live. Stay with me until the end. Because what she did with that fortune and her new life will leave you speechless. But to understand why Margaret made this radical decision, we need to go back in time. We need to know who she was before she became the invisible wife of a controlling millionaire. Because the Margaret who disappeared that day wasn't born erased. Quite the opposite. At 20, she was pure life. Long hair, always messy with splashes of paint, a contagious laugh, eyes shining with that thirst for the world that only young dreamers possess. She lived in a tiny apartment shared with 2 artist friends, where the walls were covered in colorful canvases and the smell of strong coffee mingled with acrylic paint. Every weekend she would grab a backpack and disappear to some unknown small town, just to paint landscapes outdoors. Margaret didn't have much money, but she had something far more valuable: absolute freedom to be exactly who she was. Before we continue, please check if you're subscribed to the channel. Just click the red button below. That way, you won't miss any of the inspiring stories I share every week. She sold some paintings at art fairs, gave painting lessons to children, and dreamed big. She wanted to exhibit her work in important galleries, travel through Europe, meet the masters of art, and live intensely and authentically. Her parents thought she should get a real job, something more stable, more secure. But Margaret laughed and said she'd rather be poor doing what she loved than rich living a lie. She truly believed that. At that time, the idea of trading her freedom for anything seemed absolutely impossible. It was at one of these local art exhibitions that she met Richard. He was 35 years old, impeccably dressed, wearing an expensive watch, with the confident smile of someone who had already achieved everything in life. He stopped in front of one of her paintings, a vibrant canvas of a woman dancing in the rain, and stood there observing it for long minutes. When he finally turned to Margaret, his eyes had that gleam of someone who had just found something rare. "You have an extraordinary talent," he said. and I want to be part of your journey." Those words sounded like music to the ears of a young artist struggling to be seen. Richard began courting Margaret with an intensity she had never experienced. Dinners at sophisticated restaurants, flowers delivered to her studio, promises to sponsor her exhibitions, to take her to museums all over the world. He said she wouldn't have to worry about money anymore, that she could dedicate herself exclusively to art, that he would take care of everything. For a 20-year-old accustomed to counting pennies to pay the rent, it seemed like a dream come true. She didn't realize she was trading her soul. She didn't see that behind those golden promises lay a silent price she would pay for the next 50 years of her life. The wedding happened too quickly. 6 months after their first meeting, Margaret was wearing an expensive wedding dress, surrounded by people she barely knew, saying yes to a man who promised to fulfill all her dreams. Her artist friends tried to warn her. "You hardly know him," they said. But she was enchanted, blinded by the illusion that she would finally have everything: love, art, and security. She didn't imagine that she was about to lose the only thing that truly mattered: her essence, her true identity. What if life's biggest mistakes came disguised as the best opportunities? Comment below. Which past decision would you make differently today if you could go back in time? But what Margaret didn't know was that Richard didn't want a free-spirited artist by his side. He wanted a work of art that he could control, shape, and display whenever necessary. And it took Margaret years to realize this. The first months of marriage were truly magical. The mansion was stunning, with a huge studio full of natural light that Richard had commissioned especially for her. "Paint as much as you want, my love," he would say with that charming smile. Margaret felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Finally, she could dedicate herself entirely to her art without financial worries. But the transformation began so subtly that she didn't even notice when the cage began to close. First came the gentle criticisms. "That painting is too bold, don't you think? Perhaps something softer would look better in the room." Then came the suggestions about her clothes. "You're my wife now. You need to dress according to my position." The artist friends who visited her began to bother him. "Those women are a bad influence, dear. They don't understand our lifestyle." Margaret yielded here, yielded there, thinking she was just being a good wife, adapting to the new reality. She didn't realize that each concession was a piece of her identity being torn away. 2 years after the wedding, Margaret barely recognized her own life. The studio remained beautiful, but she rarely painted. Richard always had some social engagement where his presence was obligatory. Endless dinners with businessmen and their bored wives, charity events where she smiled mechanically, business trips where she was locked away in luxury hotels waiting for him to return from meetings. Her colorful clothes had been replaced by elegant and discreet dresses. Her long, messy hair was now styled by a private hairdresser into an impeccable bun. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, but the most suffocating control was financial. Margaret had no access to any bank account. Richard paid for everything, bought everything, decided everything. "You don't need to worry about these things, my love. I'll take care of you," he would say whenever she mentioned money. She couldn't buy a simple painting without asking permission. She couldn't go out alone because there was always a designated driver. Security cameras were installed throughout the mansion, supposedly for protection. But Margaret felt the electronic eyes following her every move. The enormous house had become a prison of marble and gold. The attempts at resistance were crushed one by one. When Margaret insisted on having a solo exhibition, Richard agreed, but manipulated everything behind the scenes. He invited only people from his social circle, turning the event into a corporate party. No real art critics were invited. When she wanted to return to teaching painting, he became furious for the first time. "My wife won't work as an ordinary teacher. What will people think of me?" That outburst of anger frightened her. Margaret realized there was an invisible limit she couldn't cross, and that limit was getting smaller and smaller. Write in the comments, "I've felt trapped like this before," if you've ever experienced something similar, even in another area of your life. The worst part was that no one on the outside noticed. To the world, Margaret had everything: an imposing mansion, luxury cars, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. She was invited to the most exclusive events, photographed alongside her successful husband, envied by women who thought she lived a fairy tale. And Margaret learned to smile. She learned to wave. She learned to say the right things at the right time. But inside, she was slowly dying. 5 whole decades passed like that. 50 years of silence, of submission, of erasing her own existence to fit the mold Richard had created for her. The children were born and raised without truly knowing their mother. Margaret tried to be present, but Richard controlled even that. He chose the most expensive and distant schools, sending the boys to boarding schools as soon as they turned 10. They need an elite education, not maternal pampering, he would say. Margaret only saw her children on holidays and scheduled vacations. When she tried to hug them affectionately, they would pull away, uncomfortable with that display of affection coming from a woman who was practically a stranger. She would cry in secret in the bathroom, but never confront Richard about it. She had learned that resisting only made things worse. The former artist friends tried to keep in touch in the early years, but Margaret always had excuses not to see them. Richard subtly sabotaged any attempt at reconnection. He scheduled important appointments at the same times, creating situations where she couldn't go out. Eventually, the friends gave up. Margaret became completely isolated, surrounded by silent servants and superficial acquaintances who treated her only as the decorative wife of the powerful Richard. She no longer had her own identity. She was just Mrs. Thompson, the woman who looked beautiful next to her husband at events, who organized impeccable dinners, who never caused problems. The studio that had once been promised as her sanctuary had become a dusty storage room. Blank canvases were piled in the corner, brushes dried out, paints hardened in the tubes. Margaret stopped painting altogether around the age of 35. At first, she still tried, but Richard always found ways to interrupt her. "I need you. Here, we have an important dinner. This smell of paint is unbearable." She gave up, keeping that part of herself in such a deep place that sometimes she doubted she had ever existed. Had she ever really been an artist? Or had it all been just a dream? But there's something curious about the human soul. No matter how much you try to stifle it, no matter how many years pass, a burning ember always remains, somewhere hidden. Margaret was 74 years old, with completely white hair and deep wrinkles around her eyes. Her body had aged within that gilded prison, but inside her, kept in a secret corner that even Richard couldn't reach, there still existed that 20-year-old girl with ink on her hands and fire in her eyes. And that girl was just waiting for the right moment, waiting for the opportunity that finally arrived on the most unlikely day possible. And it was Richard's death that brought about this moment. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, during a quiet breakfast like any other. Richard was reading the financial newspaper, complaining about some market fluctuation, when suddenly he dropped his cup and clutched his chest. His eyes widened, his breath became short. Margaret jumped up in fright, called an ambulance, did everything she should have done. But while waiting for the paramedics to arrive, while holding Richard's cold hand as he lay unconscious on the kitchen floor, something surprising crossed her mind. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was an absolute clarity, almost frightening. She thought, "I'm finally going to be free." Richard died on the way to the hospital. A sudden heart attack at 89 years old. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. Margaret nodded, accepted the condolences, played the expected role of a shocked widow. But inside, something was awakening. That ember, kept burning for decades, was beginning to gain oxygen again. For the first time in 50 years, she was alone, truly alone. Without orders, without controlling glances, without needing to ask permission to exist, and that feeling was both terrifying and liberating. The adult sons arrived for the funeral, successful middle-aged men who barely knew their own mother. They were polite, formal, efficient. They organized everything with the cold business acumen they inherited from their father. Margaret watched those strangers in expensive suits and realized she felt nothing, neither maternal love nor resentment, just an emptiness where there should have been a connection. They treated her with that condescending gentleness reserved for frail, elderly people. "Don't worry about anything, Mom. We'll take care of all the details." They assumed she would be the broken widow who needed support, guidance, control. They were completely wrong. The real revelation came when the lawyers gathered the family for the reading of the will. Margaret sat at the head of the table, the same table where she had served silent. Dinners for decades. The children were tense, clearly interested in the division of the empire their father had built. And then, the lead lawyer read the words that changed everything. "I leave the entirety of my estate, property, and financial assets, estimated at $47 million, to my wife, Margaret Thompson." The silence in the room was deafening. The children received generous sums in already established trusts, but the bulk of the fortune belonged to her, all of it. Margaret saw the expressions on her children's faces: surprise, barely disguised frustration, calculation. They immediately began talking about properly managing resources, about trusted financial advisors, about not making hasty decisions during this time of grief. They were trying to do exactly what Richard had done his whole life: control. But when Margaret looked up at each of them, there was something different in her gaze, something they had never seen before. It was determination. It was power. It was freedom finally within their reach. What if the real inheritance wasn't money, but the chance to start over? Write in the comments, "My time has come," if you feel you're nearing a turning point in your life. It was at that moment that Margaret made the most important decision of her life. That night, after everyone had left the mansion, she went up to her room and stared out the window for hours. The full moon illuminated the perfectly manicured garden, the very garden she had never been allowed to tend to personally, and something inside her simply clicked. She wasn't going to live out her remaining years as a wealthy, controlled widow. She wasn't going to let her children or lawyers or anyone else decide her fate. She had waited 50 years for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. On the morning of the funeral, while everyone expected to see her dressed impeccably in black to receive condolences, Margaret did the unthinkable. She put on simple jeans and a cotton blouse she had secretly bought days before. She took a small suitcase with only the essentials: comfortable clothes, some documents, a photo of herself at 20, holding a paintbrush. She left behind all the expensive jewelry, the designer dresses, everything Richard had used to shape her over decades. And on the perfectly made bed, she placed a single, handwritten note: "Finally, I will live. Don't look for me." She descended the mansion's stairs for the last time at 6 in the morning, while the staff were still preparing coffee. She asked the oldest driver, the only one who had always been kind to her, to take her to the bus station. The man hesitated, but something in Margaret's gaze made him simply nod and open the car door. During the drive, she looked out the window at the city where she had lived imprisoned for so long and felt an inexplicable lightness. At 74, with white hair and deep wrinkles, she was running away from home for the first time in her life, and it was absolutely liberating. Chaos ensued 2 hours later when the time for the funeral arrived, and Margaret simply wasn't there. Her children rushed to her room and found the note. Panic was immediate. "She's senile," declared the eldest son. "Someone may have kidnapped her," speculated the other. The family called the police, hired private investigators, and made a huge fuss. But it wasn't genuine concern for Margaret's well-being that motivated them. It was the money. $47 million had just vanished along with an elderly woman they had always considered incapable of independent decision-making. Speculation spread rapidly among high society. Some said Margaret had suffered a nervous breakdown. Others whispered about a secret lover. Some even bet she had been tricked by con artists. No one, absolutely no one, considered the simplest and truest possibility: that Margaret was perfectly lucid and had simply decided to live, that the silent and obedient woman everyone knew had never been real. She was merely a survivor using the only strategy she had to endure decades of imprisonment, and now she was free. While everyone was desperately searching for her, Margaret was at a bus station buying a ticket to a small coastal town she had seen in a magazine years ago. A quiet place, far from the hustle and bustle, far from judgmental eyes, far from everything that represented her previous life. She didn't even know exactly what she would find there. She only knew that she needed to be near the sea, that vast blue expanse that had always represented freedom for her. The bus trip lasted 8 hours. Margaret stayed awake the whole time, looking out the window, watching the landscape change, feeling each kilometer of distance like a layer of prison being ripped away. She arrived at dusk in a charming little town where no one knew her. She found a small apartment to rent, a simple thing, just 2 rooms with a balcony overlooking the ocean. It was infinitely smaller than the mansion. But when Margaret opened the windows and felt the salty breeze coming in, she cried. For the first time in decades, they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of rebirth. That little space was hers, truly hers. No one was going to tell her how to decorate it, when to sleep, what to wear. It was her sanctuary. In the early days, Margaret simply existed. She woke up without an alarm, drank coffee looking at the sea, walked barefoot on the sand. Absurdly simple things she was never allowed to do. But the real transformation began when she entered a small art supply store in the city center. The smell of fresh paint hit her like a physical memory. Her hands trembled when she touched the brushes. The shop owner, a kind lady of about 60, asked if she painted. Margaret opened her mouth to say no, as she had done for half a century, but what came out was, "Yes, I paint, or at least I would paint, and I will paint again." She bought canvases, acrylic paints, brushes of all sizes. She spent the money without looking at the price, without asking anyone's permission. That same night, Margaret set up her first canvas on the balcony. For a few minutes, she just stared at the intimidating white. 50 years without painting. Could she still do it? Did she still have it inside her? But when the brush touched the canvas for the first time, it was as if no time had passed. The colors began to flow. The forms came to life. She painted until 3 in the morning, completely absorbed, completely alive. When she finally stopped and looked at the canvas, she saw the ocean at sunset with a white-haired woman dancing on the beach. She had painted herself free, finally free. Margaret didn't stop there. She saw an advertisement for dance classes for senior citizens and signed up without a second thought. She started frequenting a local cafe where she met other women, artists, writers, ordinary women with extraordinary stories. For the first time in decades, she had real friends, real conversations, genuine laughter. And when she saw an offer for a group trip to visit art galleries in nearby cities, she booked her spot immediately. She traveled alone, of her own volition, for the first time since her 20s. What if age was just a number, and real life began when you decided to truly live? What activity have you always wanted to do, but never had the courage to? But while Margaret flourished in that new life, the family was still in despair. It took 3 months for investigators to finally locate her. When they discovered she was living in a modest apartment in a small coastal town, her children were outraged. "She's clearly not in a position to make decisions," they declared. They planned to go there, bring her back, and seize control of the fortune under some legal argument of incapacity. But Margaret anticipated them. She knew they would eventually find her, and she was prepared. 3 weeks before she was located, Margaret had made decisions that would shock everyone. She sought out the best lawyers in the region, ensured she was in full possession of her mental faculties through detailed psychological evaluations, and then did something no one expected. She donated $23 million, exactly half of her inheritance, to a network of institutions that support women experiencing domestic violence and abusive control. She knew exactly what it was like to live imprisoned, and she wanted other women to have the chance to escape that took her 50 years to achieve. But it didn't stop there. Margaret put the mansion up for sale and created a permanent fund of $5 million to support artists over 60 who wanted to restart their creative careers. "It's never too late to create," the fund's manifesto stated. "Art has no expiration date." She established grants, free studio spaces, and exhibitions for older artists. Everything she wished she had had when she was younger. Lawyers tried to advise her to be more conservative with the money, but Margaret was adamant. This wasn't about accumulating wealth. It was about distributing freedom. In the end, she kept about $19 million for herself, safely invested to generate a comfortable monthly income. But her lifestyle didn't change. She continued living in her simple apartment, continued buying clothes in ordinary stores, continued living with a simplicity that scandalized those who knew the size of her fortune. When a local journalist finally managed to get an interview and asked why she didn't live more luxuriously, Margaret replied with something that went viral. "Money imprisoned me for 50 years. Richard used wealth as invisible chains. I won't let it imprison me again. Freedom isn't bought with mansions. Freedom is waking up and doing exactly what you want." This interview was the moment Margaret's story exploded nationally. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the 74-year-old widowed millionaire who chose simplicity, art and freedom over luxury and control. She became an unexpected symbol. Women of all ages began writing to her, sharing their own stories of imprisonment and dreams of escape. Margaret responded to every letter. She created online support groups. She transformed her own pain into collective impact. She hadn't just saved herself. She was helping to save others. When her sons finally appeared at her apartment door, 6 months after her disappearance, they found a completely transformed woman. Margaret opened the door wearing colorful clothes stained with paint, her white hair loose in the wind, a genuine smile on her face. They hardly recognized her. It wasn't just her appearance, it was her energy. It was the light in her eyes. It was the upright posture of someone who finally no longer carries the weight of a life unlived. Her sons entered in their expensive suits with tense expressions, prepared to confront her, perhaps even to force her to return. But faced with that radiant woman, all the prepared words died in their throats. Margaret invited them to sit down, served coffee, and for the first time in decades spoke to her children like adults, not like the submissive mother they knew, but like a strong woman who had made difficult decisions and didn't regret any of them. She explained the donations, the fund for artists, her financial choices. They tried to argue, saying she was being reckless, that she needed to think about the future. Margaret just smiled and said something that silenced them. "I'm 74 years old. For the first time in my life, I'm not thinking about the future. I'm living in the present, and that's priceless." The conversation was tense, but honest. Margaret didn't try to create an artificial connection with children she barely knew. She acknowledged that Richard had destroyed that possibility decades ago, but she left the door open. "If you want to really get to know me now, I'm here. But I'm no longer going to be the convenient mother you thought I should be. I'm just Margaret, and that needs to be enough." The children left confused, perhaps even a little hurt, but also, for the first time, with a glimmer of genuine respect for that woman they never truly knew. It was in another interview, a few months later, that Margaret said the words that would end up touching millions of people around the world. The journalist asked if she wasn't afraid of having started over so late in life. Margaret was silent for a moment, looking at the sea through the soul window, and then replied in a firm, clear voice, "I thought it was too late. I thought that at 74, my life was already written, that the final chapters would only be about waiting for the end. But the truth is, it's never too late to be who you've always been. The person I was at 20 never died. She was just waiting, kept safe in a corner of my soul." She continued, tears glistening in her eyes, but without letting them fall. "My only regret is not having run away sooner, not having had the courage at 30, at 40, at 50. I wasted precious time. But you know what's worse than wasting 50 years? Wasting 51, wasting 52, continuing to lose until there's nothing left. So I say to anyone listening, don't let fear steal your years. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter how much time you've already wasted. The time to live is now. It always has been. It always will be." Comment below. How many years do you think you still have ahead of you? And what are you going to do with them? These words spread like wildfire. The interview video went viral on social media, shared millions of times, and translated into dozens of languages. People of all ages began using the hashtag #It'sNeverTooLate, sharing their own stories of starting over or their cherished dreams. But it was the elderly who truly embraced Margaret's message with poignant intensity. Letters arrived daily at her apartment. A 68-year-old woman wrote that she had enrolled in violin lessons after 40 years without playing. A 71-year-old man recounted that he had finally filed for divorce from an unhappy 3-decade marriage. An 80-year-old woman began writing the book she had always dreamed of publishing. Margaret personally responded to hundreds of these letters. She created a blog where she shared her paintings and daily reflections on freedom, aging, and courage. She organized monthly meetings in her city for people over 60 who wanted to start something new in life. These meetings began with 5 people in a local cafe and quickly grew to groups of over 50. They were emotional gatherings where people shared fears, dreams, and plans. Margaret didn't see herself as a leader or guru. She was simply someone who had made a radical choice and was showing that it was possible. The real impact of Margaret's story went far beyond the statistics of views or likes. It was tangible and transformative. Shelters for women experiencing domestic violence reported a significant increase in donations after her story became public. The fund for aging artists that she created had already supported more than 200 people in just 2 years, enabling exhibitions, book publications, and musical performances. Margaret had proven something that society often forgets, that age is just a number when it comes to freedom, creativity, and new beginnings. That you can be 74, 80, 90 years old and still be at the beginning of your real life. Today, Margaret is 76 years old. She still lives in the same simple beachfront apartment she chose when she ran away. But now the walls are covered with her own vibrant and colorful paintings. She paints every day, usually on the balcony, with the sound of the waves as a soundtrack. Her works began to be exhibited in small local galleries and then in larger spaces. Art critics were impressed by the emotional force and authenticity of her work. These are paintings by someone who has finally allowed herself to exist, wrote one renowned critic. Margaret maintains a routine that would be enviable for people of any age. She wakes up early, walks on the beach, paints, meets friends for lunch, attends dance classes twice a week, and travels whenever she wants. She is finally free, truly and completely free. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that she holds no grudges. She doesn't live in the past. She doesn't lament the 50 lost years. Those years taught me the immeasurable value of what I have now, she says. Without prison, I might never have appreciated freedom so much. What if you knew that tomorrow you could start the life you've always wanted? What would you change today? Margaret's journey teaches us something profound about human nature and time. It teaches us that it's never too late to return to who you've always been at heart. That courage has no age. That freedom is a choice that can be made at any moment, even when it seems impossible. And above all, that the years that have passed do not define the years to come. Margaret lost 50 years living someone else's life, but in her last years, she lived more intensely than many people live in an entire lifetime. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel because every week I bring you real stories like this one of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. Stories that remind us that life is still happening, regardless of our age or circumstances. And look, if this video resonated with you, leave a like below. This simple gesture helps more people find this kind of content, get inspired, and realize that there's still time. And tell me in the comments, I made it to the end, and it was worth every second. That way I know you really connected with this story. I read all the comments, truly, and this exchange is what makes all of this meaningful. There's a video over here about another incredible story of starting over that will move you even more. Click there and continue watching. See you soon.